I know you kind of said this episode was maybe a little bit like homework with how long it kind of took you to get through the movie, just with how busy your schedule has been.
Yeah, I don't know if it was just like, all the stuff that I had going on here, or just, like the fact that the movie is well over 3 hours long. But so I liked the movie. I really liked Ben Kingsley's performance, obviously, but it just seemed so slow and like kind of boring at certain parts. And I know that it's like an important story to tell, and I'm really glad that I watched the movie. This is the first time I'd ever seen it.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, it was a little bit slow.
And this is probably my fourth time watching it, because I actually am I'm a Gandhi fanboy. I'm just gonna say it. So so my history with Gandhi, not just the movie, but researching the man as well. So basically, I watched the movie as I'm going through watching all these Oscar-winning movies, and probably sometime it was either during college or right after I graduated, I sat down to watch this movie because it was Best Picture winner, and I was blown away because I didn't know the story at all. In my mind, and I feel like in a lot of people's minds, yeah, Gandhi was just like this Indian guy who made his own clothes and did a bunch of fasts, but I don't actually know why he's important. I feel like he was famous for not eating food. Like, it was almost like it didn't even make sense what he did. And then within the movie, spoiler alert for Gandhi, but basically the whole non-violent resistance thing, like we also saw like Martin Luther King Jr. advocate for during the civil rights movement in America.
Right.
He used that to such an effective degree that the British Empire gave up their claim on the country of India.
Yes. So I didn't really know a ton about Gandhi before watching this movie, but I knew that he was kind of, well, I thought that he was tangentially related to Indian independence. I didn't realize he was like
the driving force.
Basically the reason.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is basically what the whole movie is about, is him getting to the point where they're just making so many problems. Basically, it's non-cooperation is what it is. Basically, like, hey, you British Empire are kind of in charge of India here technically. Well, then we're just going to not do anything. How are you going to deal with a whole country that just doesn't do anything, doesn't cooperate with any of your laws? Just until you leave, we're just going to have a nationwide sit-in and just go away. It's similar to like we saw in The Wind That Shakes the Barley with the Irish telling also the British, just go away. You're in our country and we don't want you here. Like, why is that so hard to understand?
Right. But the major and obvious difference, though, is that, the IRA was like, if you don't go away, we're going to keep blowing up British soldiers. Whereas Gandhi's whole approach was, yeah, you can beat us with sticks, you can shoot us, massacre us, but, number one, you're going to kind of look like a-holes on the world stage.
Yes, and that was a big factor. Yeah.
And it's not going to get us, you're not going to get us to fight back. So what are you going to do? Kill 350 million Indians?
Right. And that was a big factor, is like basically the British ended up having no leg to stand on. And because then they kind of talk about within the movie too, where if we fight back with violence, that now gives them an excuse to suppress us further with more violence.
Exactly.
And that was kind of the genius of Gandhi. Now, again, from my research into all this as well, so the movie does not mention at all Leo Tolstoy, which you're probably thinking, well, yeah, of course not. So they actually wrote each other, and it was, in a lot of ways, Tolstoy's philosophy that Gandhi definitely put his own spin on, but was implementing. So Tolstoy preached pacifism and this same kind of this almost responsibility to challenge authority to non-cooperation and non-violent resistance. And Gandhi liked the idea and implemented it, obviously with his own flair, and definitely made it his own thing. Is way more famous. Basically, Tolstoy was all theory. He never actually did anything in real life that was putting his money where his mouth is, so to speak, whereas Gandhi then put it actually into action. But yeah, their lives overlapped, and a lot of the last letters Tolstoy wrote were to a young Gandhi, and they corresponded. And the farm that we see him set up in South Africa,
Yeah.
where the American reporter comes and checks in on the farm and everything, not mentioned in the movie, he named that farm Tolstoy Farm.
Oh, okay.
So there was definitely a connection there too. And then again, to bring it more to, America, I already kind of mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. Well, again, it wasn't a coincidence. He was very obviously specifically inspired by Gandhi. And so when Martin Luther King Jr. was trying to do the same thing in the South, non-cooperation, peaceful marches, it was directly inspired by Gandhi. Dr. King was very intentionally doing the exact same thing that Gandhi did in India to get the British out, was what he was trying to do to fight for civil rights, which is why he was very against any kind of... And again, it helped turn public opinion to your side when you're refusing to fight. And again, when I first watched this movie, that is what blew me away when I realized, again, I'm talking to the Marine here, but it takes more courage not to fight. They got in a line and marched to... They want to get in this. There's a certain factory that they're basically shutting down, or anyway, they're wanting to get into the factory.
It was the salt factory. Yeah. So I guess at the time, for some reason, it was illegal for them to make salt.
Basically, because the British salt companies had a monopoly that was like government backed.
Right. So they were making salt by the ocean, and they got run off the beach by the British. So they were gonna. He called it a raid. But it looked like there was more just like they were going to demonstrate, like do a stage of demonstration at this salt factory. But yeah, it was just column after column of his supporters. They just walked right up to the gate and they all got beat with clubs. And then, the women came and kind of scooped up that rank, and then the next rank came. And
the guards are trying to keep them out there, and they're just going to like, we would like in, so we're going to just march toward them, and we would like to get in. Oh, you beat me over the head? Well, now I'm unconscious? Okay, now the guy behind me is going to walk forward, and you're just going to... Martin Sheen has an interesting role in this as the American reporter, and kind of a powerful moment in the movie is when he's calling back and basically says, like, any moral superiority the British might have claimed was gone in minutes after watching this scene. Now... The Martin Sheen reporter character is fictional-ish. He's kind of an amalgamation of multiple actual people, but he's the character he plays is not a specific historical figure. But let's reset to the beginning. So we actually start the movie with his assassination, and then his funeral. And then the famous quote from Albert Einstein, "Generations to come will scarce believe that such a one as this ever in flesh and blood walked upon this earth," is what Einstein said of Gandhi, that basically he's too good to be true. So as the commentator, it's kind of weird they have commentators during the funeral, but as the commentator mentions, when this crowd of millions of people are showing up for his funeral, this was a guy who, what was he? He didn't have like a great scientific achievement. He wasn't a traveler, inventor, discoverer. He wasn't a political leader. He held no specific office. He wasn't a religious leader specifically. He was just a guy who inspired his country to not cooperate with those oppressing him, to the point that he became one of the biggest celebrities in the world, just through non-cooperation.
Right. And he was never a dictator or a country leader or an elected official of any kind. He was just a guy, an influential guy.
And again, you could say the same. The comparisons to Martin Luther King Jr. are apt, because Martin Luther King Jr. never ran for office that I know of, or never held any office in Washington, D.C. anyway, and he was a pastor. But again, he was just someone who was well-spoken and vocal about leading for his cause. That's basically who Gandhi was. So then we cut to the beginning of his story within the movie. We actually go back to 1893, and we see a young Gandhi on a train in Western clothes. So that's also another one of the biggest misconceptions that kind of blew me away, is everyone sees Gandhi as this poor Indian guy basically dressed in rags. That was a specific choice to basically show solidarity with poor Indians who couldn't afford better clothes. He could.
Right. I mean, it's kind of a big deal in the movie. He talks about wearing homespun, which is like cloth made in India.
Right.
Because there were a lot of British fabric companies that were kind of responsible for a lot of the, like they show in the movie, the guy talking about, well, we used to grow indigo, but now, these English companies make all the cloth. And so nobody wants our indigo anymore. Now no one here can make any money. and but they
Right.
still expect us to pay rent and stuff. And so yeah, Gandhi's like, all right, well, we're only going to wear Indian cloth now, because he felt that it was kind of immoral to support those companies by wearing cloth made in the UK.
Yeah, and just the thought that their dependence in certain areas on British goods was also then impoverishing large parts of their country. So how were these British supposedly even a net positive? And
Right.
and again, that was kind of the whole thing, where it's like, we want the freedom to control our own country. Why do you consider that whole so hard to understand? And something that I think we talked about it a few weeks ago, and I don't remember with which movie. And I don't think it actually made the episode. I think it was just something we talked about after the fact. But the idea that there's just this undercurrent of white supremacy with the British Empire. They just saw themselves as superior, and that they needed to, we're going to go over there and basically take over these areas of people who are not as, militarily advanced as us, and they can't stop us from coming in and taking over. And then the idea that it became this paternalistic thing too. Well, we're there for their own good. It's like, no,
Right.
you aren't, you racist a-holes. Go back home.
Right, because in the eyes of the British Empire, their colonies in India and Africa and, in the Caribbean, they were like, well, these people, they're just savages, and we know how to rule and govern, so we're going to do it for them, whether they like it or not, because we actually know what's best, and how could they ever rule themselves?
Right, and even Churchill, who I'm always a big fan of Churchill as well, but he was, I hate to use the term with our modern context on white supremacists, but yeah, Churchill saw Gandhi as just some upstart brown guy that was getting too big for his britches. Like, he didn't respect what he was doing.
Right.
He didn't think he had any right to do it.
This is like really well exemplified in the movie when he's having a meeting with British officials, and he says something about India, shouldn't be subject to alien rule. And the British guy on the other side of the table laughs like that's a joke. Like, what are you talking about? India is a British colony. Like, it's part of Britain. That's not alien rule. Like, we deserve it. Like, it just never even occurred to him that he was an occupying force, basically. He's like, no, it's like the British deserve to keep India. What are you talking about?
I don't disagree. I saw that as just what happens after decades of time pass. So in that person's mind, Britain had controlled it for as long as they just got there. I feel like
right.
You don't think that if you just got there, but I feel like, again, because of just kind of how this man grew up. Yeah, so 1858 was when British Crown rule was established in India. Yeah, it was basically, from that guy's point of view, depending on when we are in the movie's timeline here, it had probably been at least 60, 70 years since the British took control. So this guy had known nothing else his whole life except that India is part of the British Empire. But yes, to your point, he completely missed Gandhi's point of, yeah, but why? You don't,
Yeah.
you don't, no, you just took over. Yeah, we don't want you here, and this is our country. So it's important to note that Gandhi was no saint. And the movie, I don't think, paints a completely unrealistic version of him, but it paints an idealized version of him. And something that showed up in my research here was that, well, we see him in the movie fighting for what seems to be equal rights for, the minority that he is, or of course, it's a kind of a majority-minority situation in that they outnumber the whites, but he's basically trying to get the Indians in South Africa at the beginning of the movie. That's his big first thing, is to get the Indians in South Africa treated like the British citizens that they are. He wants them treated equal to the white British citizens. What the movie doesn't mention is that, yeah, not like them darn Africans. He wasn't saying everybody's equal. He's saying, don't treat us like the blacks, treat us like the British that we are. And couldn't care less about how the black Africans were being treated, because he kind of had his own superiority. And again, I'm not saying he's racist any more than I kind of want to say Churchill's racist, but I'm just saying history is complicated, and it's tricky when we're using this 21st century lens to look at these things. And again, I think Gandhi's views evolved on that. This was obviously a young Gandhi who was in South Africa before he ends up back in India and dealing with getting rid of the British there. And I think his eyes were kind of open maybe to some larger issues there at play. And I don't think he would actively, treat Africans any worse himself. But as far as what he was advocating for, it wasn't equality for all. It was, we're British citizens, treat us like it, and really didn't care about the Africans. So yes, the picture everyone has of this cotton-wearing, rag-wearing, poor Indian guy is a construct that he did in solidarity with the poor later in his life. When he's in South Africa, he is a young lawyer educated in London.
Right.
His family was able to send him to London to go to school, where he learned to became a lawyer, comes back and unsuccessfully tries to start a law practice in India, and after a couple of years, hears about a job opportunity in South Africa where they just kind of need some help with some lawyering stuff. And that's why he heads over to South Africa, basically just to get a job. And South Africa was not yet a country, not that that's super important, but in 1893, it wasn't yet the country that it is today. It was just kind of not consolidated in the same way yet. That didn't happen until just before Gandhi left, actually around 1910. And the movie does kind of mention how long he's there, but they kind of gloss over it. He was there for like 21 years. So this was a significant portion of his life that really only takes up, about 15 minutes of the movie, just kind of at the beginning there.
Yeah.
But it's significant because it's the first time Gandhi is putting into practice these principles of nonviolent resistance and non-cooperation. And the term that's used, of course, again, I'm not going to be able to say this right, but it's like satyagraha. And I don't know if they say that term in the movie specifically, but that's kind of Gandhi's own personal brand of nonviolent resistance, and just kind of a big thing he advocated throughout his life was this satyagraha. So the subtitle of his autobiography is, again, I don't have it right here in front of me. It's like My Experiments with Truth, or the story of my experiments with truth. So for Gandhi, it was kind of all about, it doesn't matter what is, or like the way we kind of run society. It's like, no, what is the actual truth? What is actually right? And what should we be striving for? And kind of always having that ideal, even if I'm the only one in the room speaking up against an injustice, I'm going to be that voice in the room speaking up against injustice. Even if it means getting killed over it, I'm willing to kind of make that sacrifice. And he would do these little experiments. What would happen if I did this? And so the first one they kind of show in the movie here is, okay, even though we're members of the British Empire, we're required as Indians to carry this pass. But basically the English British, the whites, don't have that same requirement, even though we should be equal members of the British Empire. So I would like to express my basically disagreement with that law by burning this pass. And he kind of gets beaten up, and someone else gets arrested, and he kind of makes the whole deal of, I'm just going to keep burning these passes because they are wrong, and I don't care what you do to me. And again, I think that pretty much did happen, or something very similar to it in real life in South Africa there. So yeah, then in the movie, we kind of just flash forward then 20 years to now we're in the 19-teens. I think it was in 1915 right around when he comes back to India and kind of gets this hero's welcome, which again is accurate. He had basically, in his advocacy for the rights of Indians, he kind of became a worldwide celebrity because that was just in the South Africa side of things. So then by the time he gets to India around 1915, he was already kind of celebrity. So we kind of see that in the film too, where the boat shows up and it's like there's a huge crowd there to see him. And who is it? Who is it? Oh, it's this Gandhi guy who just like really is kind of fighting for the people and not afraid to speak up against the British. So we think he's pretty neat. And he kind of starts doing those things in India that we already kind of talked about with the non-cooperation with the British, and ultimately reaching the point where he says, you need to leave our country. They kind of think it's a joke. And then World War II happens, which the movie doesn't really focus on. It just kind of skips over, but that kind of just interrupts the British flow, so to speak. And we don't need to go into the complete detail of everything. There is kind of the famous Salt March where he marches to the ocean to make salt, just as a big protest, and that was followed by the other scene we mentioned with the guys marching on the thing. There's another scene where they're kind of meeting and they're sending the cavalry toward them, and someone has the good idea of lay down. The horses basically will see us as an obstacle not to be walked on. And so I don't know if I'd have the courage.
Is that real? Is that like...
that I didn't research.
I had never heard of that before. I was like, oh man, I don't know.
Almost the way they filmed it, I feel like it's gotta be. And I can see, because remember, a horse isn't just going to like run off a cliff, or if it sees something that seems unsafe to walk on. I mean, they're kind of smart, kind of dumb, I feel like, with horses. So I feel like if you just have this squiggly mass of humans laying on the ground, the horses are going to be like, no, which is kind of what we see in the movie. And I'm not saying I'm going to try it, but I feel like I could see that working with a mass of people. I think one person, no.
I thought maybe I'd like miss something because like in the movie they're like yeah, lay down, the horses won't walk on us. Everyone's like, oh yeah, you're right, they won't. That's a good idea. And I was like, wait, what? That's
true. How did they know that and we don't? Right. I choose to believe it. If someone listening says that's not a thing, let me know. So then basically we just kind of we talk about getting back in 1950 and then I just jumped to World War II almost 30 years later. But that's basically what it was. He just spent time in and out of jail, but also long stints of jail. We kind of jumped, forward in the movies. They'll even say like many years later, and he spent a lot of time in and out of jail, basically being charged with like sedition, because he was trying to raise the people up against the people in charge. That is the definition of sedition, right? And then of course he writes lots of things. The autobiography I mentioned that I've read was written while he was in prison during these years. So nicknames. So his given name is Mohandas Gandhi, or often Mohandas K. Gandhi.
Yeah, I didn't know that Gandhi's name was Mohandas Gandhi. I had always heard him referred to as Mahatma Gandhi.
Yes.
But I didn't realize that is a title and not a name.
And not even an official title. It's basically just a nickname, but one given in reverence. It basically means great soul or venerable, whatever. He was so well liked that the Indian people gave him this nickname of, great soul. So yeah, you still hear him today called Mahatma Gandhi as just his nickname. And then the other nickname he gets as he gets older is Bapu, meaning father. So yeah, he was kind of this father of the country in a lot of ways that ultimately helped them gain their independence through nonviolent means. Like it worked. The British left. They basically said, screw it, it's not worth it anymore, and went home. And I just find that fascinating. Now, the other significant thing we have not addressed is the Hindu versus Muslim issue within India at the time.
Right, this is something that we kind of talked a little bit about in the Pater Panchali episode. That movie it was made shortly after the partition. Obviously, it didn't take place during that time, but it's kind of when that movie was made, they were like looking back on a time where it was what they considered, the better time. Specifically a time where Hindus and Muslims kind of lived together in relative peace and harmony up until the partition of India, which from what I know, basically the British tasked some guy with drawing a line on the map because they were going to divide India into one country that was going to be secular but majority Hindu, and then which was India, and then Pakistan, which is majority Muslim. And so they basically just haphazardly drew the borders, and it caused a whole ton of problems that we see in the movie. It basically, it caused mass migrations from Pakistan, Hindus living in Pakistan migrating into India, and Muslims in India migrating into Pakistan. And a ton of violence. A lot of people died. And something that they talked about in the movie, when they first bring up the partition, I forget the names of the characters that are talking about it, but the guy says, well, we're just going to have a partition. The Hindus are going to have their country, and then all the Muslims, they can have, the Muslim majority areas. That's going to be Pakistan. And some guy goes, what are you talking about? Like, there are Muslim majority sections on opposite sides of the country. And that didn't matter. Because when they drew the borders, Pakistan, it was split. You had Western Pakistan, which is what is still called Pakistan today, and then Eastern Pakistan, which today is Bangladesh. But at one point in time, actually for many years, it was Western and Eastern Pakistan, and it was one country basically separated by the entire subcontinent of India.
Yes, and now, though, what the movie also talks about and shows is that the Muslim faction wanted their own country. And now I did not research specifically about how the lines were drawn, but they do mention, like you were saying, this the Muslim majority areas become Pakistan. But the Muslim they show in the movie, the Muslim leader, he's all for it. He does not want to submit to Hindu rule any more than he wanted to submit to British rule. And so he's advocating for Pakistan on behalf, even though they would get, like you said, the British are kind of involved in drawing those lines. Then Gandhi, he's the biggest outspoken advocate against that because he, again, as kind of this peace-loving guy, he just wants them, like, no, we're all Indian. I don't care what religion. He's like, yeah, I happen to be Hindu, but I'm good friends with all these Muslims. I'm good friends with, this Christian guy we've seen throughout the movie. He's like, I don't get it. Why can't we just all be one India together like we were before the British were here? Like, he's like super, super passionate about it. And so even though he was successful in getting the British to leave, Gandhi fails in his attempts to keep India united. Not just with the British partitioning it, but with the Muslims and also obviously the Hindus themselves, didn't seem to have a big problem with the Muslims wanting to have their own country. But yes, it then led, like you were saying, to a lot of violence in the migrations that follow when not only are the Muslims leaving to Pakistan, well, there was plenty of Hindus in Pakistan that were then coming back. And so on the border, where specifically in the movie, they show violence break out, is right on the border as the different camps are marching along. And then one of Gandhi's last fasts is to try to get everybody to stop the violence because he was loved by both sides. So even though he was Hindu, the Muslim population was still a big fan of Gandhi and respected what he did. They still just didn't want to do what he was saying about staying as one country. They would rather split.
Right.
So the assassin, and I feel like either I missed this in the movie, and every time I watched it, I guess for some reason I thought that his assassin was a Muslim that just didn't like this Hindu guy. But no, it was a Hindu nationalist who basically didn't like how cool Gandhi was with the Muslims. So Gandhi was killed by basically a Hindu radical. And I don't feel like they mentioned that one way or the other in the movie, or I kind of was confused by...
They don't. And I wonder if that was a deliberate choice. But yeah, they don't really go into who killed him and what his reasons were, it's kind of commendable on the part of the filmmakers because I don't really think it's important.
Well, I guess they do show him as part of the group he's with, and maybe I was just confused on what group that was with. I didn't really understand if it was a Muslim or a Hindu group at the time. It was apparently a very anti-Muslim Hindu group because he just kind of chastised them. Is the assassin in that group when he's chastising him?
You mean when they come to his house?
No, when he's in the car getting ready to drive off somewhere, and there's that group outside that are basically threatening another group, and he basically just like, he's about to cry, just telling them, he's like, just stop it. And I didn't know if the assassin was in that group or not.
I don't know.
And is this I feel like this is a quote from the movie and not just from his autobiography, but like there is another point where he basically says, when they're bashing the Muslims, and he's like, I am a Muslim. I am a Hindu. I am a Christian. I am a Jew. Like, it doesn't matter. Let's just all get along. He basically says, I'm all for these things.
Yeah, I don't think that exact quote is in the movie.
Okay.
But he does talk about, like, oh, well, when I was a boy, when I would go to temple, they would read, from the Hindu holy book. I forget the name of it, and from the Quran,
the Bhagavad Gita or something like that.
Right, because he's, basically saying like it didn't matter where the words were coming from. Everyone was there to worship, their God, and it was like a community thing.
Yep. And he kind of the point we've talked about many times here, just the whole idea of drawing lines tends to cause more problems than it solves. Even if they're right, quote unquote the right line, you're still going to have issues because now all of a sudden you're just inevitably then going to think differently and lesser of people on the other side of the line. So his assassin was, because they really don't address it in the film, they just kind of cut to, he gets killed, and then we cut to his funeral. But the guy was arrested. It took about a year to get everything resolved. And Gandhi's sons even actually were hoping to get the guy's sentence commuted, but the prime minister said, nah, and he was ultimately hanged about a year after he killed Gandhi. Oh,
so his family even, that's crazy. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That they wanted their father's assassin's sentence commuted. That's how committed to the whole pacifist, nonviolent thing.
Now getting a little more of Gandhi himself, and this is, I'm going to pull a little more just from my memories of reading his autobiography about 15 years ago, so this could be a little rough, but in his autobiography, Gandhi kind of admits to being an absentee or negligent father, and we don't see his kids, and we see his wife a lot, but we don't really see his kids much in the movie, a little bit at the beginning when they're little, and kind of beyond that, we don't see them.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of weird that they come and visit him. It's in the colony, right, in South Africa. And then he's like, he's holding his kids, and then they run out of the room, and you literally do not see them again for the rest of the movie.
But that's kind of accurate to what I remember reading. That basically, and again, this is something I think, now, again, I know how we kind of view things in the United States. I don't know how common this mentality or sentimentality would be in India at the time. But basically, with what Gandhi was trying to accomplish, he considered it selfish to value his own children over the lives of the rest of the country. And that, yeah, I'm a bad father, but I'm doing something more important. And that was how he saw it.
And like, maybe he was right.
Exactly. No. And again, it's almost kind of hubris the way you could argue, again, I don't have kids, but it's kind of, you could argue that it's hubris the way we view it in the United States of, well, obviously you put your family before all else. But what if there is a greater good and you could literally, free 500 million of your countrymen from oppression by, again, his kids still ended up being okay. Their dad wasn't around because he was saving the world, so to speak.
Yeah.
And yeah, he kind of admits to being, and we see a little bit too where he didn't rough up his wife exactly, but basically says, hey, if you're not going to treat yourself as equal to everyone else here, and he kind of like starts pushing her out the door.
Oh yeah, he really yells at her. He's like, well, then you don't need to be here. Basically tells her like, get out then if you're not going to buy into it.
And he kind of grabs her. And again, this is the non-violent guy. But that would happen. Like, again, in the autobiography, he's not afraid to admit his faults. So like, he would like, I don't know if it was a kid, but I remember he would get angry and strike someone. The big pacifist, it was more like he was large-scale pacifist, not small-scale pacifist.
Yeah.
But again, he never claimed to be perfect. Another little anecdote from the autobiography that I think is kind of fascinating that kind of sums up maybe his worldview. So, he's basically kind of a vegan, and, at one point, he gives up, say, milk. And I do think it was specifically milk, where he's like, I swear off milk. I am a guy who doesn't drink milk. And he was in the hospital, one of his fasts or something, and one of his friends or nurses or whatever ends up, when he's eating again, but he's just kind of sick and in recovery, and they accidentally give him milk, and so he has now broken that how many years long of not drinking milk, and the person's like, oh my gosh, I am so sorry, I forgot you didn't drink milk, oh my gosh, please forgive me. He's like, his response was just so, yeah, I still don't drink milk. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, he's like, any kind of streak or whatever, like, that's the principle is what matters. So it's just like, yeah, right. I still don't drink milk. You did nothing to change that. You gave me a little milk. That doesn't mean I suddenly drank milk now. Like, right. It's not a big deal. And I just thought it was an interesting approach. And I think, again, sometimes, looking specifically at diets and maybe other things too, we hold ourselves to this perfection standard, not realizing you can falter and still be the person you want to be. So I think that's something I kind of got from Gandhi's autobiography, that it's not about being perfect. It's about just trying to always be better, and perfection shouldn't be the goal. And again, the quote that's often attributed to him that I don't know if he exactly said is, be the change you want to see in the world. And there is something to that. There really is. And I think there's a reason that his story and his persona still resonates well into the 21st century now. And he is this kind of person who has this mystique associated with him, even though I feel like a lot of people don't really know a lot about him. And I think we should. I think he's very, very important and can continue to inspire future generations.
Oh, towards the beginning of the movie, it's actually right after he meets the priest that's helping him out in South Africa.
Yes.
And they're walking down the street.
Oh, yes.
And they are accosted by a very young Daniel Day-Lewis.
That is correct, yes.
And I look it up, and this is like one of his first movies.
Yes.
And he's doing an awesome South African accent.
That's true. Because of course he is.
Back then. He's just killing it.
He probably spent a year in South Africa preparing for his 3 lines in Gandhi.
Yeah.
And it almost is kind of it almost seems like they're highlighting him in a weird way, even though he's just in this one scene. Like, he's like calling up to his mom or whatever, like, you need to get to work. And he's like, yeah, just dealing with this guy on the sidewalk.
I was like, oh man, is he gonna come back? Like, is he, gonna be like, one of the white South Africans? Learns this lesson? Nope.
Never see him again. Not in this movie. Okay, so the one other thing I wanted to mention, and then we can talk about the accolades of the movie itself here. So, in my fanboyism of Gandhi and kind of when I was kind of just out of college, I remember talking to someone who had someone younger than me who was basically at a college dorm with someone from India. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. Like, ask him about Gandhi. Because I was like, that was my, like, I was kind of curious to get a perspective from an Indian person, though. And I didn't ever actually talk to them, but my friend did. And I thought it was interesting. They were like, could take him or leave him. And we're kind of like, Gandhi. And I was like, what? And it's like this, this person, a friend of mine who had met someone from India, and this person from India was basically like anti-Gandhi. Now, I never got confirmation on my theory, but I feel pretty confident in my theory here. Someone who's come over, again, especially 20 years ago, someone who came over to the United States to study from India was more likely to be from a higher caste. And the people from the higher castes would greatly resent Gandhi's disillusion of the caste system.
Right.
Because today, it doesn't exist. I mean, it still exists, I think, to some extent. I didn't do a lot of research on this, but it's not what it used to be. And it did kind of start with Gandhi, this kind of abolishment of the caste system, especially formally. I think there's still kind of remnants of that as seen by my friend's friend not really respecting Gandhi. Because, like, the dude's on their money and stuff. Like, nationally, he is recognized. But I think there's a lot of resentment there from the former upper castes against him for basically saying they're equal to the lower castes. Again, that's my theory. I don't have confirmation on that, but I think I'd be willing to put some money on that. There's probably that's probably where that resentment comes from. So the movie itself did win Best Picture in 1982, and maybe a bit of an upset, even though it kind of did so well at the Oscars. Because you'll see, I got 1, 2, 3. It won 8 Oscars, was nominated for 11 total. But I saw an article from 1982 or early 1983 talking about how it was a no-brainer gimme that E.T. was going to win Best Picture this year. That it was just so obviously like nothing else we've ever seen before, and this groundbreaking film, and from this director that's already given us a couple Best Picture nominees and needed his first Best Picture win, and obviously E.T. was going to win. And this was an article written at the time, and then Gandhi comes in and wins everything.
So I think the no-brainer, obviously, that year would have been Ben Kingsley as actor. But I think I kind of agree with that. I think E.T.'s a better movie, and I think that Spielberg did a better job directing E.T. I mean, there's not really a ton direction-wise. There's not like anything super crazy going on in Gandhi that Richard Attenborough is doing, at least not on the level of E.T. I mean, I think if I was voting at the Academy that year, I would have voted E.T. over Gandhi.
Yeah, and the other 3 nominees that year they're solid movies, but they're fairly lackluster by today's standards. It's Missing, The Verdict, and Tootsie. So
yeah, I haven't seen any of those. So
and I've seen them all, but they're more just kind of. Tootsie was fairly famous at the time for kind of it's Dustin Hoffman trying to go dressed as a woman to further his career. But the other 2 I couldn't even remember. I mean, I think the one has got Paul Newman as a lawyer, and I've seen Missing, but I don't even remember what it's about. It looks like Jack Lemmon there. Anyway, kind of just smaller stories. So the 2 big movies of the year were definitely E.T. and Gandhi. If you're looking at spectacle and big, they're going to be those 2. So it's probably a 2-person race. Yeah, I think, E.T. being definitely more innovative. I can see what you're saying and what that person who wrote the article I was talking about was saying, that how could it not? Now, I don't know if they were saying that in a world where they hadn't yet seen Gandhi as a legit contender against them, or if they just thought it was still that much of a gimme. But there's also been the long history of sci-fi/fantasy movies not doing well at the Oscars. Remember the first fantasy movie to win Best Picture? Return of the King.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe the E.T. was because it was sci-fi. People are like, it's just like a fun alien blockbuster movie. Like this is the important Gandhi's the important movie, but to an extent, I guess that's true.
And again, is there a little bit of that guilt playing into like we feel like we should vote for Gandhi out of this? Oh, I don't want to say white guilt necessarily. We're talking about something from the 1980s, and I don't necessarily know all the social political stuff involved. But you wonder if something like that is a factor.
I mean, maybe, but Gandhi is also. I mean, it is a good movie.
Oh, no, absolutely. It's just not. It's not innovative.
And honestly,
as a film,
it checks all of the boxes for
Yes.
Oscar bait.
Yes.
You
And
know,
that's what gives it the edge. Yes.
it's super long. It's a, important historical story. It's a true story. It's biographical. It's like the role Ben Kingsley was born to play.
Right.
It kind of had it. It was like teed up as far as the Oscars are concerned.
Yeah, and he is half Indian, so
Yeah,
you can kind of so
I think isn't his birth name is Krishna.
yes. So his birth name is not Ben Kingsley. He has an Indian name and an Indian. I do believe it was his father, not his mother, that was Indian. Yeah, very much kind of born to play it. And I always am surprised how relatively young he still is. We saw him. He's kind of the old guy in Hugo or whatever that we talked about. But when I've seen this movie, I guess I didn't realize when I first saw it probably, oh, this is young Ben Kingsley made up to be old Gandhi as well. So it wasn't like they
Right.
Recast it. So he's playing Gandhi from 1893 all the way through 1948. So
Yeah.
what is that? 55 years he's playing Gandhi.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see, Ben Kingsley himself in 82 would have been about 39 years old. So he was playing, it's kind of, I guess, a good mix there where he was playing about 10 years younger because he was in his early 20s when he went to South Africa because he was actually only about 45 when he came back to India 20 years later. So Ben Kingsley was actually quite a bit older than Gandhi would have been on that scene in the train, but then obviously plays him all the way through his death in his 70s.
And so the movie Gandhi, what we're talking about, it was nominated for a hair and makeup Academy Award, but the Quest for Fire won.
Oh, which is like one of my very first episodes. Yeah. Oh, so I think you might have mentioned it, but yeah. So Richard Attenborough was the director who we saw as Frenchie in The Sand Pebbles.
Yes, and something else that this movie has in common with the movie Sand Pebbles is the use of the slur coolie.
Yes.
Which obviously in Sand Pebbles, it's Americans, and they're referring to Chinese people. And then in this movie, I think it's in the scene that you mentioned earlier where Gandhi is getting off of the ship from South Africa, and he shows up, wearing like traditional Indian clothes, and the British say he's dressed like a coolie.
Yes.
And I was like, wait a minute. Isn't that the same slur that they used in Sand Pebbles to talk about the Chinese people? And apparently it's like a slur that pretty much anywhere there was like European colonialism,
the locals were called coolies. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the other one they mentioned is it Kaffir, or how do they? I feel like I'm saying bad words in other languages here. But
I heard that word. I didn't know what it was, or I guess
that's basically the N word in South Africa.
Oh, okay.
And of course, there's the whole dynamic too. Whereas I had college teammates from South Africa, and I just texted one today. He's up in Detroit right now. Hi, Werner. So I've met like 9 people from South Africa in my life, but they're all white. And even though they were all friends and great people, I also kind of feel, even at the time and looking back, they were all probably a little bit racist, but just because I don't want to justify it, but I just feel like the world they grew up in kind of just led to that, because they grew up when as apartheid is going away. So basically their control over the country was ripped away from them during their lifetimes. And so they grew up, I remember I had one of my friends who basically talked about, the South African flag where it has kind of that arrow coming in from the side, dividing the 2 other stripes. Yeah. And he kind of says we see that as the new government just dividing our country. And I'm just like, oh my gosh. And anyway, but I think the term Kaffir was something they said with pretty freely while in the United States. And I'm reading on here where it's basically a racist slur against blacks. And I'm just like, yeah. But it's just an interesting world perspective is kind of the reason I brought it up.
I just had 2 little, extra reading things, I guess. One is there's a series on the Wired, like Wired magazine, on the Wired YouTube channel, where a accent expert and dialect coach named Eric Singer talks about accents in movies and TV shows.
Okay, I think I've seen him before, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the, I think it might have been like the very first episode, but he actually talks about the movie Gandhi, specifically how Gandhi's accent changes over the course of the movie. So like at the beginning when you see him on the train, he's got like a more what you would think of as like a British accent. And then as he gets older, he adopts more of what you would think of as like a stereotypical Indian accent. So like when he's talking to the two guys on the train, he's speaking with a British accent, which is what Ben Kingsley actually sounds like, in real life. And then as he gets older and spends more time in India, he adopts more of a regular, what you or I would think of as a Indian accent.
Interesting.
And apparently that's accurate to real life. I guess some people point to that as, why is he speaking two different ways? But that's like his accent actually did evolve. But those videos are also super interesting to watch.
I heard an interview with Ben Kingsley. This was several years ago, and he's very proud about this performance, and rightfully so. But he was kind of bragging in a little way, where he's basically saying, he was talking about, I don't know if it was maybe to Attenborough. He was still auditioning or whatever, and like sends in a tape of him talking like Gandhi, and Attenborough thought it was a tape actually of Gandhi.
Oh, wow.
And so Ben Kingsley was kind of proudly saying, it's like, no, that's me on the tape. Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, you got the part. Because, yeah, he's very British, but he does have this Indian ancestry as well. So if you ever want the antithesis of his performance in Gandhi, you need to watch him in something called Sexy Beast.
Okay.
He's kind of a little bit of a gangster type, just like super foul-mouthed and fast-talking. He was actually nominated for Best Supporting Actor in 2002 for Sexy Beast.
Another YouTube video, the Vox, VOX YouTube channel has a series called Borders, and they do an episode about India and Pakistan, and it goes a lot more in depth than we did, obviously, in this podcast. But the guy in the video goes a lot more in depth into kind of the history of how they drew the borders and why it was maybe not the right way to do it, and then the problems that it's caused and the tensions that exist between Pakistan and India even to this day. But yeah, that's another one to check out if you want extra info on the subject.
Yes. So we did backtrack several decades this week to go back to the end of the 19th century through Gandhi's death in 1948. Next week will be similar as we cover several decades in the life of the last Chinese emperor in The Last Emperor.